Hello friends, my name is Ryan, and today I'm going to tell you a story named The Stephen Port Murders the Grindr Killer's Victims, which is a very amazing story full of twists. So, let's start. In a quiet corner of East London, where the bustling streets give way to narrow alleys, and the hum of city life begins to fade into the night, there were whispers in the shadows. The city had always been a place full of stories, some sweet, some tragic, and some that would chill your bones. But the one I am about to tell you is one that still haunts the streets of London to this day, a story that rocked the world when it was finally uncovered, leaving behind a trail of mystery, heartbreak, and chilling revelations. It all began in 2014, when a series of deaths began to plague the city. They appeared to be accidental at first, a string of seemingly unrelated incidents. Young men, some from the LGBTQ+ community, were found dead in the most peculiar of circumstances. Some thought it was a case of misadventure, others believed it was just the unpredictable nature of life in the big city. But no one, not even the police, could have known just how dark and twisted the truth would turn out to be. The first victim was Anthony Walgate, a 23-year-old fashion student. He was found lying in a nearby street, his body lifeless, with no obvious signs of struggle. The police initially treated it as a death caused by a drug overdose or an accident. But as days passed, more bodies turned up, each one more chilling than the last. The names began to surface: Gabriel Kovari, 22, Daniel Whitworth, 21, and finally, Jack Taylor, just 25 years old. All had died under strange, eerily similar circumstances. They were all found alone, in remote areas, their bodies discovered far from the places where they'd been last seen. But what no one knew at the time was that there was something more sinister at play. There was a man behind these deaths, a man whose identity had yet to be discovered, a predator who had hidden in plain sight. Stephen Port, a 40-year-old man who, on the surface, seemed like nothing more than an average guy, was about to become the face of one of the most chilling crimes in British history. Port was a man who had lived in the shadows, a quiet and unassuming individual who had a dark secret. He had a penchant for using Grindr, a popular dating app for men, to meet his victims. But these meetings, which seemed innocent enough at first, were anything but. Through the app, he would lure unsuspecting men to his flat, where he would drug them, assault them, and ultimately, take their lives. He had found the perfect way to target his victims, using the anonymity of the app and his charm to win them over before unleashing his true, monstrous nature. It wasn't until after the bodies began to pile up that the truth started to unravel. But even then, the police were slow to act. They failed to make the connection between the deaths, and it took far too long for the pieces of the puzzle to fall into place. The victims, all young men, had been connected in such a subtle way, but the police had missed it. Each had been murdered by the same method, and each had been placed in a way that suggested the killer had planned it carefully, even down to the final moments of their lives. It wasn't until Jack Taylor's death that the investigation began to take a more serious turn. His body had been found outside Port's flat, and finally, the authorities began to connect the dots. Through an investigation that stretched across months of painstaking work, the police discovered that Stephen Port had been the common thread between all the victims. But it wasn't just his involvement that sent chills down their spines, it was the fact that Port had been able to slip through their fingers for so long, all while continuing his killing spree without anyone suspecting a thing. As the investigation deepened, it became clear that Port was no ordinary killer. He was a man who knew how to manipulate the system, how to keep his dark deeds hidden in plain sight. He had used Grindr not just to find victims, but to create a facade of normalcy. He would invite men into his home, offer them drinks, and before they knew it, they would be drugged, their bodies too weak to fight back. And when they were gone, he would move on to the next, as though their lives meant nothing. But despite his efforts to cover his tracks, the truth eventually emerged. In 2016, after a prolonged investigation, Stephen Port was finally arrested and charged with the murders of 4 young men. The evidence was overwhelming: DNA found on the victims, messages exchanged between Port and the men on Grindr, and, most damning of all, Port's own confession. At trial, it was revealed that Port had drugged his victims with lethal doses of the date-rape drug GHB, a substance that he knew would leave no trace and render his victims helpless. The sheer cruelty of his actions, coupled with his cold, calculated behavior, left everyone who heard the story horrified. The court found him guilty of all charges, and he was sentenced to life in prison. But the story doesn't end there. The victims' families, their friends, and the entire community were left to pick up the pieces. The tragedy of what had happened to these young men who had been taken from the world far too soon, lingered in the hearts of all those who heard their stories. They were remembered, not just as victims, but as individuals with their own dreams, their own futures, and their own hopes for love and companionship. And yet, despite the horror of it all, there is a strange sense of justice in the conclusion of this story. Stephen Port, the Grindr killer, was brought to justice. He was caught, tried, and convicted for his unspeakable crimes. But that does little to ease the pain felt by the families and friends who lost so much. So, what can we learn from this terrible chapter in history? It serves as a reminder that evil can hide in the most unsuspecting places, that darkness can creep into the most innocent of interactions. It shows us how easily trust can be broken, and how we must always remain vigilant, even in the most seemingly safe of spaces. As we reflect on the lives lost, the families affected, and the justice finally served, let us remember the importance of community, vigilance, and compassion. The story of the Stephen Port murders serves as a chilling reminder of the dangers that lurk in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered. And if you found this story gripping and full of suspense, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, Let's Try Everyday, where we bring you more stories that will leave you questioning the world around you. Until next time, take care and stay aware.